Guys, it's Miss Clark. We are going to be doing the May 20th reading lesson. Even though it says May 19th, we're going to be doing chapters 3 and 4 of Sideways Stories from Wayside School. So you need to have this in front of you as well as your literature guide. Okay, so you need both of these, and I'm going to read the first part. So as a warm-up, tell me one detail about Mrs. Gorf and Mrs. Jules. Or you could tell a neighbor. All right, let's continue. So, chapter 3, here are the questions before we start. Joe, number 1, why does Joe have to stay in during recess? Number 2, even though Joe is saying the correct numbers for Mrs. Jules, he is still wrong. Why? And then number 3, what happens when Joe comes to school the next day? All right, keep those questions in mind, and we will read chapter 3. Chapter 3, Joe. This is what it looks like. Okay. So Joe had curly hair, but he didn't know how much hair he had. He couldn't count that high. In fact, he couldn't count at all. When all of the children went to recess, Mrs. Jules told Joe to wait inside. Joe, she said, how much hair do you have? Joe shrugged his shoulders. A lot, he answered. But how much, Joe? Asked Mrs. Jules. Enough to cover my head, Joe answered. Joe, you're going to have to learn how to count, said Mrs. Jules. But Mrs. Jules, I already know how to count, said Joe. Let me go to recess. First, count to 10, said Mrs. Jules. Joe counted to 10. 6, 8, 12, 1, 5, 2, 7, 11, 3, 10. No, Joe, that is wrong, said Mrs. Jules. No, it isn't, said Joe. I counted until I got to 10. But you were wrong, said Mrs. Jules. I'll prove it to you. She put 5 pencils on his desk. How many pencils do we see here, Joe? Joe counted the pencils. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. There are 5 pencils, Mrs. Jules. That's wrong, said Mrs. Jules. How many pencils are there? Joe asked. 5, said Mrs. Jules. That's what I said Joe. May I go to recess now? No, said Mrs. Jules. You got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way. You were just lucky. She set 8 potatoes on his desk. How many potatoes, Joe? Joe counted the potatoes. 7, 5, 3, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. There are 8 potatoes, Mrs. Jules. No, there are 8, said Mrs. Jules. But that's what I said Joe. May I go to recess now? No, you got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way again. She put 3 books on his desk. Count the books, Joe. Joe counted the books. 1,000, 1,000,000, 3. 3, Mrs. Jules. Correct, said Mrs. Jules. May I go to recess now? Joe asked. No, said Mrs. Jules. May I have a potato? Asked Joe. No, listen to me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Mrs. Jules. Now, you say it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Joe. Very good, said Mrs. Jules. She put 6 erasers on his desk. Now, count the erasers, Joe, just the way I showed you. Joe counted the erasers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10, Mrs. Jules. No, said Mrs. Jules. Didn't I count right? Asked Joe. Yes, you counted right, but you got the wrong answer, said Mrs. Jules. This doesn't make any sense, said Joe. When I count the wrong way, I get the right answer, and when I count right, I get the wrong answer. Mrs. Jules hits her head against the wall 5 times. How many times did I hit my head against the wall? She asked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You hit your head against the wall 10 times, said Joe. No, said Mrs. Jules. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. You hit your head 5 times, said Joe. Mrs. Jules shook her head no and said, Yes, that is right. The bell rang, and all the other children came back from recess. The fresh air had made them very excited, and they were laughing and shouting. Oh, darn, said Joe. Now I missed recess. Hey, Joe, where were you? Asked John. You missed a great game of kickball. I kicked a home run, said Todd. What was wrong with you, Joe? Asked Joy. Nothing, said Joe. Mrs. Jules was just trying to teach me how to count. Joy laughed. You mean you don't know how to count? Counting is easy, said Mauricia. Now, said Mrs. Jules, what's easy for you may not be easy for Joe, and what's easy for Joe may not be easy for you. So now I'm going to turn the page. Nothing's easy for Joe, said Mauricia. He's stupid. I can beat you up, said Joe. Try it, said Mauricia. That will be enough of that, said Mrs. Jules. She wrote Mauricia's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Joe put his head on his desk between the 8 potatoes and the 6 erasers. Don't feel bad, Joe, said Mrs. Jules. I just don't get it, said Joe. I'll never learn how to count. Sure you will, Joe, said Mrs. Jules. One day it will just come to you. You'll wake up one morning and suddenly be able to count. Joe asked, if all I have to do is wake up, what am I going to school for? School just speeds things up, said Mrs. Jules. Without school, it might take another 70 years before you wake up and are able to count. By that time, I may have no hair left on the top of my head to count, said Joe. Exactly, said Mrs. Jules. That is why you go to school. When Joe woke up the next day, he knew how to count. He had 55,006 hairs on his head. They were all curly. All right, so that was chapter 3. Don't forget to answer the questions for chapter 3. Go ahead and pause the video now, and then we're going to move on. All right, so the questions for chapter 3 are right here on the screen. I will read them again. Why does Joe have to stay in during recess? Even though Joe is saying the correct numbers for Mrs. Jules, he is still wrong. Why? And then what happens when Joe comes to school the next day? Remember, these are on this page right here. And this page right here is where you're answering. Okay? So keep it open on this page because you're going to have chapter 4 as well. And also, don't forget to do a character card at the front of Joe. Okay? All right. Now, chapter 4, Sherry. So we're going back to this book, and we're going to read from it. Remember, you can underline or highlight stuff that you read. So, here are the questions about Sherry. Number 1, what does Sherry spend all of her time doing during class? And number 2, describe what happens on one hot afternoon. Chapter 4, Sherry. Sherry has long eyelashes. She weighed only 49 pounds. She always wore a big red and blue overcoat with a hood. The overcoat weighed 35 pounds. The red part weighed 15 pounds, the blue part weighed 15 pounds, and the hood weighed 5 pounds. Her eyelashes weighed 1.5 pounds. She sat next to the window in Mrs. Jules' class. She spent a lot of time just staring out the window. Mrs. Jules didn't mind. Mrs. Jules said that a lot of people learn best when they stare out a window. Sherry often fell asleep in class. Mrs. Jules didn't mind that either. She said that a lot of people do their best learning when they are asleep. Sherry spent all of her time either looking out the window or sleeping. Mrs. Jules thought she was the best student in the class. One afternoon, it was very hot. All of the windows were open. Yet Sherry still wore her red and blue overcoat. The heat made her very tired. Mrs. Jules was teaching arithmetic. Sherry pulled the hood up over her face, buried herself in the coat, and went to sleep. Mrs. Jules, said Kathy, Sherry is asleep. That's good, said Mrs. Jules. She must be learning something. Mrs. Jules continued with the lesson. Sherry began to snore. Mrs. Jules, Sherry is snoring, said Kathy. Yes, I can hear her, said Mrs. Jules. She must be learning an awful lot today. I wish the rest of you could be like her. Sherry began to toss and turn. She flopped over on top of her desk and then rolled over on top of Kathy's desk. Then she rolled back the other way. Kathy screamed. Sherry rolled out the window. She was still sound asleep. As you know, Mrs. Jules' class was on the 30th story of Wayside School, so Sherry had a long way to go. After she had fallen 10 stories, Sherry woke up. She looked around. She was confused. She wasn't in Miss Jules' class, and she wasn't at home in bed. She couldn't figure out where she was. She yawned, pulled the hood back over her eyes, and went back to sleep. By that time, so I've turned the page, that time she had fallen another 10 stories. Wayside School had an exceptionally large playground. Lewis, the art teacher, was way over on the other side of it when he happened to see Sherry fall out the window. He ducked under the volleyball net, hurtled past the kickball field, hopped over the hopscotch court, climbed through the monkey bars, sped across the grass, and caught Sherry just before she hit the ground. The people in Mrs. Jewell's class cheered. Sherry woke up in Lewis's arms. "Darn it, Lewis," she said. "What did you go and wake me up for?" "I'm sorry, Sherry," said Lewis. I'm sorry, Sherry repeated. "Is that all you can say? I was having a wonderful dream until you woke me up. You're always bothering me, Lewis. I can't stand it." She laughed and hugged him around the neck. Lewis carried her back up 30 flights of steps to Mrs. Jewell's room. That evening, when Sherry went to bed, she was unable to fall asleep. She just wasn't tired. All right, so again, you're going to complete the questions about Sherry, which is what does Sherry spend all of her time doing during class? And describe what happens one hot afternoon. And I also want you to do her character card, which is towards the beginning. And then I want you to think about this question. Which character are you most like and why so far that we've read? Okay, so that's the end of chapters 3 and 4. Make sure that you've completed this so we can go over these during our Google Meet. Bye.